Hi everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We're just waiting for our guest speaker Rolake to join. Hi Bure. Hi Vona. Hi Rolake. Okay, let me get this set. Yay! Okay, great. Hello. Hi Rolake.
Hi, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? How's your day
I'm
been?
good, thank you. Hello, everybody.
Hello, hello. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining. Yeah, happy it's working now. Okay. So today we have Rolake Akinkugbe-Filani with us today, and I'm just going to introduce what this is about. So this is Ignite Energy Africa, and we're an innovation and knowledge hub to help shape the future of energy in Africa and globally. And so we're running like an online summit to interview different energy experts and energy enthusiasts to find out about, just to hear their thoughts about, the pandemic, COVID-19, how they think it's going to affect the energy industry, what opportunities they see coming out of this, and just know their thoughts and also find out why they came into energy. So today we have Rolake with us. She's an energy expert and finance executive. She's also the managing director of Energy Inc. and also the senior Nigerian advisor to IFU, the Danish Investment Fund. So good afternoon, Rolake. Thank you for coming on today.
Good afternoon. Okay, nice to be here. Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. If anyone has any questions as we go on, please just comment and we would ask at the end. We'll ask Rolake at the end. So I'm just going to start by asking, Rolake, can you please introduce yourself and tell us what made you, what attracted you to the energy industry?
Thanks, Vome. This is a sector that I'm really, really passionate about. And I literally say that I live, breathe, eat, sleep, drink, sing energy, talk energy, obviously. But so in terms of, let me start from what I'm doing now. So I run a consulting firm called Energy Inc. Advisors, number one. The second thing that I do is I'm also the senior Africa advisor to the Danish Investment Fund. So I'm helping them invest in infrastructure and energy projects across the continent. And then thirdly, I also run a non-profit social enterprise called Today, which is focused on helping small SME entrepreneurs in the energy space access funding, because as we know, access to finance, which is something I'm really passionate about, is a major challenge for them getting their businesses off the ground. How and why did I start working in the energy sector? I think it really started many years ago when I went to university in the UK and I saw the impact of natural resource extraction on African economies like Nigeria and many others. And the fact that you had nations like Nigeria, like Angola, like Congo, Brazzaville, and the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, who were very resource rich, but yet they still grappled with many economic challenges. And even though I'd grown up in Nigeria and I'd grown up in an environment where we had challenges with electricity supply, I still remember times growing up when my parents or they would tell us, oh, you need to quickly iron your clothes before a certain time because the generator is going to go off. And so a lot of us actually lived through and we grappled with these issues, whether it was lighting a candle to study at night because you've run out of diesel and there was no grid electricity. But it wasn't until I got abroad that I really started to frame the issues in my mind, and I started to have a better understanding of what it meant to lack energy and the whole issue of energy access. So that was what really sparked my interest. And of course, over the years with my career, I've tried to align a lot of the things I do with a focus on that space.
Okay, that's great. I have a similar experience as well. So, like growing up in Nigeria, when you see, okay, you're used to power being cut off, and then you come here and you see that it's a different kind of life, right? And I did an MSc in global management of natural resources, and then you get to really see, the issues with natural resources, how you manage it, how it affects the economy, how it affects your world, education, and everything. So, yeah, energy is definitely exciting, and there's so much opportunities, which is what I'm very passionate about that as well. So that's interesting. And I was going to ask as well. So even before this whole pandemic, how would you have described the energy landscape in Africa? Like what's it been like?
Yeah, so let's just even dimension it in our heads. When we're talking energy, we're talking a very broad range of things. So I like to put it basically in three broad buckets. So you have the oil and gas space in Africa, and then you have the power sector. Now, within each of those, there are different types of energy sources and energy uses. So, of course, with the oil and gas sector, which we also call hydrocarbons, or we call it fossil fuels, because the original materials that make up crude oil, which is extracted from the ground, came from many, many, many centuries and thousands of years of deposits and sediments that came from, I don't know, prehistoric creatures or just earth material. That's why it's called fossil fuels. And hydrocarbons and fossil fuels, i.e. oil and gas, have been a large part of the energy landscape in Africa for many, many years. In fact, I would say of say 100% of the African economies that are dependent on oil and gas, I would say about 80 to 90% of them are actually dependent on it for the bulk of their foreign exchange revenues. So they sell and they export crude oil in exchange for revenues. And that is how a lot of these economies manage to survive. Then we move over to the power sector, which is also part of the energy sector. And within the power sector, you have power that is sourced from gas, which is a fossil fuel, but you also have power that is sourced from renewable sources of energy, i.e. the sun, the wind, water, waste, plant material, waste material, household waste, and geothermal. I could go on and on. So you had this sort of tension between renewable energy sources and non-renewable energy sources for a very long time. As you're very well aware, the world is moving towards non-renewable energy sources, and Africa still has a long way to catch up. But I've always been of the opinion that the continent needs a mix of energy sources in order to survive, because you have different types of uses for industry, for commercial business, and for residential business, individual consumers like yourself and myself.
Okay, so that's interesting. So your view is that we will need a mix in Africa, and is that based on the fact of that we're behind the world? So in order to catch up, we kind of need to still survive on that mix, or is that a view of a global thing that you think that energy globally we still need to depend on the mix, or is that Africa focused?
So let me just put it in context. I'm sure a lot of you would have been following the climate change debate of recent years, and you'd have been hearing a lot about the Paris Agreement, the Copenhagen Agreement, etc. So basically, Africa has the lowest carbon footprint of any region of the world. What that essentially means that its contributions to global CO2 emissions, which is the polluting substance that fills the air from heavy industrial activity that is energy intensive, is the least. I think its global footprint is less than 1% of the global carbon footprint. But on the other hand, Africa is actually one of the most affected regions and continents by climate change. And I'll give you some very practical examples. If you look at Nigeria, for instance, you have desertification in the north, where the Sahara Desert is increasingly encroaching on what would be arable farmland. We're also seeing changes in climate patterns and the amount of heat or sunshine or rain we get in a year. We have urban metropolises like Lagos and other major cities who are facing a problem with flooding and the encroachment of the Atlantic Ocean. All of those things are a sign of changing climatic conditions. And much of that is as a result of global warming, which essentially has seen sea level rises. Now, part of the global agreement is that we want to limit global emissions to less than 1 degree. To about, it was 3 degrees, and then that was revised. We want to cap it and keep it there. And the challenge for many countries that sign up to these is how do they actually implement that in their individual countries or continents. So if you take a country like Nigeria or even West Africa, Nigeria currently has an estimated 400 trillion cubic feet of gas resources. And we know that gas is a fossil fuel. So are we essentially saying that Nigeria should stop extracting its gas resources because it doesn't want to contribute to climate change and that problem? Having said that, gas is a much cleaner fuel than crude oil. Again, are we saying we should completely stop the extraction of crude oil because we want to limit our carbon footprint globally. That is a difficult decision for any policymaker. And if you look at it realistically, for an economy that depends on crude oil for 90% of its livelihood, literally, it is an uphill task. So it goes back to my point about the fact that we need to be pragmatic and look at what works for our individual countries in Africa. And part of the work that I'm seeking to do is to say, you know what, let's bring all these voices around the table. I advise oil and gas clients, I advise power sector clients that you utilize fossil fuels for power generation, but I also advise power sector clients that utilize renewable energy sources and clean energy sources for power generation. And I think we all have a part to play in the rural mix. And the thing I would say to most people, like, people see the energy sector as this really specialized thing that's only for a few smart people or very cerebral people. But the reality is it affects all our daily lives. If you're an SME today, right, and I'm sure those SMEs that are listening, you're probably spending close to 30% and 40% of your overheads, guess what, on electricity. That is the reality. So you can't divorce yourself from the issue. Let's even leave your overheads and your spending aside. Let's look at the plastics, the Tupperware, or some of the plastic bowls that we use to just package our food or our takeouts, right, for food. Those plastics are made from petrochemicals. And guess what the petrochemicals derivatives come from? They come from gas, which is a fossil fuel. This same gas that we say has some level of contribution to global emissions, although its contributions are lower. So the reality is, no matter who you are, what industry you are, you may be a musician, a lawyer, an engineer, you utilize fossil fuels every day in your life in some way or the other, right? And this is what we say for those who are very hardcore about the climate change debate. We hear you, and obviously I'm an advocate of cleaner sources, but at the same time, I'm a pragmatist, and I realize that what Africa actually requires is a balance of different energy sources.
Yeah, I totally agree. What you said about energy, because energy literally runs the world. Even during the pandemic right now, we need energy to power hospitals. We need it to deliver food to your house. We need it to do everything that we're doing. So it's very important. And I also think, in addition to what you said, also thinking about innovative technology. So for example, this carbon capture and storage technology that they're developing, finding a way to integrate it with fossil fuel power plants. So yes, we can still use the gas, we can still use them, but we capture the carbon emissions, and maybe focusing more on technology like that makes us use fossil fuel, but use it in a way that is still clean for the environment. I think there's a big opportunity there in terms of developing technology that helps us do that.
Absolutely, okay, all right.
Okay, so my next question was going to be, what made you start Energy Inc? What made you start it, and what challenges have you had in the energy industry since you started your company?
Okay, so like I was telling you, I basically do 3 different things where the energy sector is related. So I'm going to sort of clarify. So Energy Inc. is my consulting business. It is a large part of my bread and butter. It's where I earn my daily bread literally from. And that basically involves advising and consulting for people who want to enter the energy industry, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa. So market research, market intelligence, finding them opportunities. Then I have a non-profit called Not Today, which literally means light has come in Yoruba, which is my mother tongue. And the whole concept of that is that beyond these big guys that I'm consulting for in the corporate world, there are a lot of smaller players who don't have access to markets, who don't have the opportunity to network with investors, who require funding for their businesses. So that second pillar of work that I do is essentially looking to support to those entrepreneurs. And like I said, a lot of the work I do with Energy Inc. advisors is actually focused predominantly on fossil fuel clients, so hydrocarbons clients, oil and gas clients, and power sector clients who use gas as the main feedstock for power generation. So in my own professional life, I'm also somewhat replicating that whole idea of Africa needing a balance in its energy mix, right? And so, you know what, I'm advising the big players. I'm also advising the little guys who perhaps cannot afford the big consulting fees that some of the bigger players play. And the main challenge we're actually seeing, and which is what really drives the work that I do, is access to finance. A lot of people talk about SDG 7 and access to energy and universal access to sustainable, affordable, reliable, and clean energy. But you can't get a lot of those projects off the ground without funding. And the thing I always say is that there's actually no shortage of global capital. The issue is really around the shortage of what I call bankable opportunities. So opportunities you can literally take to the bank and leverage for cash. And that can mean different things to different people. So for an SME, it may be that they lack collateral, right? They don't have assets they can sweat or they can leverage to access funding. It may be that they have some flaws in their business model. They've not completely thought through their customer base and how to effectively service that customer base. It may also be that they have problems with their technology and the proof of concept around that technology, whether it's viable. So it could be a whole range of things. And I think more so in COVID-19, it's important to build sustainable business models, right? And so let me give you a practical example. For a local oil and gas company, building a sustainable business model in the downstream space may mean that actually, let's look at 10 years, 15 years down the line, where we look at whether for your retail pump business, where you and I drive our cars to take petrol, whether we need to look at adapting or diversifying into electric vehicle charging points, right? Because the time will come where we will still require fossil fuels and we'll still need to put gasoline in the car and diesel in some cars, but there may also be more cars on the road that require charging of their batteries because they're electric vehicles. So as a downstream oil and gas business, I should also be thinking about pivoting, not necessarily away from my core business, my value proposition, but actually introducing new product and service lines so that my business model is more sustainable through different cycles and different seasons. And I think more than ever, COVID-19 has shown the importance of ensuring that we're essentially staying ahead of the curve.
Yeah, definitely. So for example, in the UK, one of the things they are working on is things called like mobility hubs, where you can have a hub where there's a station where you can have electric car charge and charge where you can charge your car, you can charge your scooters, your e-bikes, but you can also get petrol, you can get diesel, you can do different things in one place. And so yeah, that diversifying solutions I think is very important in the energy industry, that there's not one solution problems, but many solutions. But also I wanted to ask you, in terms of like, if I wanted to start an energy company, a small business, or start maybe producing energy storage or batteries, and I need money, I need finance, practically what advice would you give to someone young who doesn't really have enough connections, doesn't really have money, or has an idea? What ways can they seek funding?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is actually come to us at Enough Today, right? So I'm sort of plugging Enough Today, our social enterprise. And the reason I say come to us, if you're looking at an energy business, particularly in the energy transition theme, and what I mean by that is sort of new energy technology. So whether that's solar PV or hybrid, things like electric vehicles or battery and storage technology for renewables, that is something that the social enterprise does specialize in. And what we've developed is a framework, and we call it the lean business model for developing a business plan around your idea. Now, we don't have a lot of startups in that particular ecosystem, but we do have companies that have been around for 2 or 3 years who've gone through the stage of proving their concept. And that proof of concept is everything from, is there an addressable market for your product? One of the most basic and fundamental questions. If you look at even large-scale oil and gas projects, a typical gas project requires markets to make the project or the venture viable. That's the first thing. The second thing is, what type of technology are you really looking at using? Do you have the capabilities in-house to develop that technology? Has it been tried and tested in other markets? Is it new? Is it viable? Is it scalable, right? Those are the things that you need to think about. The second thing is, what is the structure of investment you're seeking? And how can you structure your business in such a way that you can leverage in investment? So for instance, if you've been a going concern, a company that's been operating for a couple of years, and you're seeking to raise equity, and you have a relatively healthy balance sheet, Of course, you can raise that equity at corporate level. If you're deploying a project as a project sponsor, where that project you already have experience and management track record in deploying projects, similar projects, then you can actually leverage the future cash flows from that new project and create an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, that will act as the borrowing entity or the receiving entity for the equity investment or the equity raise. If you're completely at conceptualization stage, and this is ideation as we call it, then I would most likely that you join some sort of incubation hub. And we're building out that model at Innoside Africa, especially for energy innovation enthusiasts. But you also have other people like Niger Startups, you have the Enterprise Development Center, and many, many more, the Clean Technology Hub, who are also providing an ecosystem of support for entrepreneurs. But the most important thing is that every entrepreneur or young professional has the capacity to develop a lean business model on paper. There are two things that I always say that you need to think about. Can your product sell, right? And below that, there are several other things that you need to think about. Can your product sell? That's number one. Does it have a market? Will people buy it? If so, what would it look like? And then secondly, the technology and the sustainability of it, right? Is it workable? Is it something that's going to require high levels of maintenance? If so, do you have the in-house capabilities? Do you need to outsource? Do you need to partner, right? There's no point in replicating something that has been done before. And so I'm all for partnerships. So, as a young entrepreneur, based on my experience and some of the networking we've helped our entrepreneurs in the Innoside ecosystem do, I think one thing always comes across is that many times an investor is actually investing in the person, right? So the management and the outlook of the entrepreneur, of the owner of the business, is just as, if not more important than the actual business they're seeking investment for.
Definitely, I definitely agree with that. Partnerships, looking for incubators, and also selling yourself and making sure your product actually has a market. Those are the key things that I picked on. Okay, that's interesting. My next question. So a lot of people have been concerned about oil prices. Like you said earlier, a lot of African countries are very dependent on fossil fuels. Nigeria revenue mostly comes from oil. And so what do you see the short to long-term effects of this on, the Nigerian energy industry, oil and gas, in terms of the economy? What do you see the effects being?
Well, I think the oil price picture has different implications depending on your profile as a consumer, whether that's an industry level, a country level. So for those countries that don't export oil, that primarily import finished products, right? And there are many markets like that don't actually have resources. It's going to be felt at the pump, right? In fully liberalized markets, you're going to see prices of gasoline come down fully. So most American consumers now, the price of what they call gas, which the rest of the world actually calls petrol, has actually come down because of falling prices. So it's great for consumers in that sense, assuming it's a liberalized market and the effect of that low oil price is actually passed on to consumers, which can be a good thing. If you're a producer, clearly you're selling your oil at a much lower price and potentially you're making a loss. So I'll give you an example. Nigeria produces, the cost of production in the Nigerian market for a barrel of crude oil is anywhere from $15 a barrel to $30 a barrel. So I'll ask you, Vome, where are oil prices today? Oil prices today are roughly, I think as of yesterday, Brent, which is the global crude oil benchmark, was at $29 a barrel, right? So what that means is, and this is just a rough generalization, I can't go into all the sort of complexities of how crude oil is priced, but this essentially means that for a country like Nigeria, you're essentially selling oil, if you can sell it at all, at a price that is lower than how much it costs you to produce it. So simple business sense means that Nigeria as a country is making a loss, right? As a business, you will essentially be forced to shut down because you can't keep up payments. That's essentially what you need. That's what it means. So I think you can see the impact it has on a country like Nigeria. But there are also other impacts. There's the economic impact. The government this year had a budget where it had forecasted the oil price would be $57 a barrel. Obviously, that forecast has been blown out of the water because oil prices fell significantly below that. So it's had to revise its budget. It's had to scale back its spending plans. And a couple of days ago, Nigeria got a $3.7 billion relief package approved by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So, of course, Nigeria has had to go and get a rescue package. And even with that money that's been given to Nigeria, it will still not be enough to cope with the full effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what does this tell me? And I think there are a lot of lessons here, because we've heard a lot about businesses pivoting, businesses bootstrapping, trimming their belts, and trying to cut out excesses. What this means for Nigeria is that Nigeria is not going to be able to afford all her expenditure plans for the foreseeable future. So something is going to have to give, right? And so if you're a business and a company, you have to be thinking around the same. You're not going to be able to afford to pay your debts, number one, if you have debts. You have to go back to banks to renegotiate your loan terms and conditions. And that's true for oil and gas producers who are highly leveraged, i.e. they're exposed to debt finance. And so you can approach it from one or two ways. You completely downsize, right? So you trim your expenditure. And unfortunately, in some industries, we're seeing that there being a lot of layoffs. And the energy industry has also felt it to a large extent. Also, you then say you're going to embark on pay cuts, right? Alternative is you actually find new additional streams of revenue, diversification, or you try and tweak your business model. These are all the things that can apply if you're a country, if you're an economy, if you're an SME, or if you're a big business, right? So it's the oil price environment is really posing a major challenge to many economies and many companies at the moment. But what I would say is that if you want to work in the oil and gas industry, that is hydrocarbons or fossil fuels, you need to understand that it is a cyclical industry. And what that means is that it goes in peaks, it goes in dips, right? And you have to be prepared to deal with that. And of course, there are many strategies that companies go through to deal with that. If you're on the renewable energy side or the clean energy side, the falling oil price has some implications. So one of the things that a lot of people in Nigeria will tell you when you want to go to them to offer a solar home system, for instance, they'll tell you, oh, solar is really expensive. You know what? I can't afford it. But what has happened is that over the last 10 to 15 years globally, the price of solar panels has actually come down. And it has come down because a lot more people are manufacturing solar panels. So the ecosystem and the supply chain is building. There are a lot more players. So there's more competition, which is forcing prices down. So solar over the last couple of decades has actually become more competitive. And so it's been competing in some markets with your diesel generators. So if you think about a country like Nigeria, where the grid, our reliance on the grid is limited, because frankly, a lot of people, if you can afford a generator, whether it's one of those smaller, what we call like Better Pass, My Neighbor generators, or some of the big old diesel generators, you're often on your generator, right? So you're, as a consumer, you're mostly off the grid anyway. So if someone comes and offers me a solar home solution today, I'm going to be comparing what is the cost of investing in that solar home solution versus using my petrol small generator or my big diesel generator. And by and large, solar is actually cheaper in terms of operating expenditure over time than fossil fuel sources like diesel. However, it is not necessarily cheaper than the grid, right? But we don't often use the grid because the grid is unreliable and it's unstable. So I think one of the things we'll see is that as gas prices fall, because gas prices trail oil prices, and gas is the main source of power generation in Nigeria, in the long term, we might see tariffs actually come down. In the long term, in the short term, tariffs are actually going up. It will mean that solar will face stiffer competition in a low oil price environment from fossil fuels, because low oil prices impact gas prices, which eventually fall, which become cheaper, which means that will drive down the cost of production, but not necessarily the cost of running down the business, and potentially that will compete more closely with solar. But look, those are just the broad takes on the impact of oil prices on different segments of the oil market. There's positives, there's negatives. Hopefully it will force countries to sit up more and not be so hugely reliant on fossil fuels going forward.
Yeah, definitely. So, for example, in the UK, they are saying that because of the pandemic, people are looking at the climate crisis a bit more, because people are saying, okay, if we're going to a climate crisis, if the coronavirus pandemic has done this, what will be the effects of a climate change crisis? And so what the government is doing is that they're actually trying to encourage people to like move into renewables, so to try and get electric cars, solar, and all those different things. And even right now, when people are not hiring, they're actually hiring a lot of people to look into clean energy policies. So there's that drive, because, for example, they're saying this pandemic is going to be like the final push to pushing people towards renewables. How do you see, for like Nigeria, for example, the government? So how do you see the government's involvement in terms of, this energy mix, in terms of, this transition? Do you see this being a push that comes from the government or from private sector? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so the renewable energy sector in Nigeria is actually segmented. So you have the off-grid, the mini-grid, and the utility scale. Utility scale essentially means that the large IPPs, which are feeding into the whole electricity value chain, so the generating companies then send to the transmission companies, then sent to the distribution companies, broadly speaking. And then you have the off-grid and the mini-grid renewable energy sector. There is no major utility scale renewable energy IPP, except one which I think has been given the go-ahead. Most of the large-scale independent power projects are gas to power projects. However, there is a growing pool of renewable energy projects that are off-grid and mini-grid. So for instance, solar home systems, standalone solar plants that serve commercial or industrial consumers. And there is legislation like the mini-grid legislation, which actually guides the operations of companies that are in that space. So the regulatory framework is actually evolving, but a large part of the push has actually come from the private sector. For instance, in the work that I do now for the Danish Investment Fund, I advise them on infrastructure investments in Africa. We're seeing a lot more companies that are providing alternative energy solutions to institutions like banks who have multi-site operations across the country, or embassies, or hospitals, or schools, as a cheaper and more efficient alternative to using diesel generators all the time. So the private sector is doing a lot of work there, and the private sector is doing a lot of advocacy. I think what we're seeing, if I take it back to the sort of climate change and the impact of COVID, there was a picture I posted on my Instagram stories some weeks back, which actually showed for the very first time that you could see the top of the Himalayas. The Himalayas are, I think they're somewhere bordering South Asia, the mountains. Why? Because the skies were clearer. So one clear impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown and the significantly downsizing in transportation, and thus lower emissions from cars, has been clearer skies and actually a much better environmental condition in many, many countries. China, for instance, has significant levels of carbon emissions. India as well. These are large emerging markets. So we're seeing some positives, and it's actually brought the climate change debate to the fore. However, some people actually also argue that a lot of the activism we've seen from climate change advocates is actually misplaced, because now no one is really moving around. So there are no huge planes that are flying between countries and regions that are increasing and contributing to CO2 emissions globally. So I think, look, there are opportunities and there are challenges in this climate. I think I can understand why a lot of African policymakers have not been obsessed with the climate change debate. But like I said at the start, it actually affects us. Right? Yeah. Let's not forget that in northern Nigeria, for instance, you have these nomadic populations that have depended on grazing as a lifestyle for their cattle and their livestock. And many of these populations are being pushed further south due to desertification, the drying of their land, and the change in seasons and patterns, right? The increasing stretching out of the Harmattan season in northern Nigeria and parts of the Sahel. All of that is actually climate change. So I don't think it's justifiable to say, well, Africa has a low carbon footprint, so we should not join the debate, because actually the reality is all this flooding and the requirement for irrigation projects is exactly because of climate change. So we cannot remove ourselves from the debate. We have to take it seriously, but I also think we need to be pragmatic and look at what energy and fuel sources actually work for us as an economy.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think one thing this pandemic has shown us is that whatever happens in any part of the world actually affects everyone. The world is very global, so we can't like close our eyes to what's happening generally because we have a lower contribution. Just to say, anyone watching, if you have a question, because I have just two more questions for Rolake. If you have any question, please comment and I'll ask her at the end of the interview. So my last question, kind of like my second to the last question, I kind of like spoken about this, but what key opportunities, you've spoken about the different points, but what key opportunities do you actually see emerging from this pandemic?
Okay, the one thing that is increasingly close to my heart is how we supply our healthcare infrastructure with electricity. If you know very well, one of the most affected industries by this unstable grid supply that we have has actually been our hospitals and our clinics. And, you know, I'm not just thinking of those that are in the urban areas, but those in the semi-urban and rural areas where it's a major challenge. You know, in some parts of Africa, one of the main contributions to maternal health challenges right at birth is just lack of electricity and the inability of hospital equipment to properly function. And where it does function, simple things like power surges or surges in voltage have actually damaged equipment and make it difficult for many of those facilities to invest in equipment in a sustainable way. So I think a big opportunity we're seeing now is how we supply critical and essential healthcare infrastructure with electricity. And I personally think that the renewable energy industry has a major role to play in doing that. And in fact, in the last 2-3 months with the onset of this pandemic, we've actually seen some organizations in the private and public sector, for instance, the Rural Electrification Agency, OLON, which is an impact investment firm, and developers like GVE Projects and others, Oxana, Energy Solar, they've all come together to deploy emergency healthcare facilities and intensive care units with off-grid solar energy. So I think there's a huge role for the energy industry to play in that regard. And I think that's something that we at Enough Today and certainly at Energy Advisors look at supporting a bit more. And then the second place is that there's actually a lot of funding. There are huge sources of capital that are available for cleaner energy sources, but we haven't been able to tap into them effectively as a result of the reasons I mentioned. And right now, there are many organizations like Sustainable Energy for All, which is a global agency working on SDG 7 that are introducing new funds and grants to help power these alternative energy solutions. So if there's anyone out there that has a solution, an innovative solution that wants to tap into the grants and funding available, this is something that Enough Today as a non-profit social enterprise can actually support them in achieving.
Okay, great. Well, what was actually interesting is that when I did the last interview and then speaking to you as well, she spoke about how there's actually a lot of funding, and she was talking about actually government funding, but a lot of people wouldn't just apply because they're like, oh, it's the government, who probably wouldn't get it, and then people don't even research it. So there's actually a lot of funding you could get to even start opportunities. There are a lot of incubation hubs. There are a lot of people doing things that could get you off. So this opportunity, I know with the pandemic, people are like focusing on the challenges, but I think it's important we also focus on the opportunities that are there. So yeah, my last question before I ask the other questions. So I was reading about you and I saw you're a woman working in the energy industry. I also read your article about going back after maternity leave, and I found it interesting. I just wanted to ask you, how do you find being a woman working in energy? How did you find going back after maternity leave? What was it like for you?
Okay, of course, I went back to full-time work after I had my little boy at his 15 months now. And I mean, it wasn't easy, but at the same time, I wouldn't say it was difficult. It was just what it was, right? You just find a way to cope and adapt to whatever circumstance you find yourself. I think the one thing I will mention is that, you know, there's always the question, can women have it all? I say yes, a woman can have it all if she has support, right? So it's life is about seasons, and it's about embracing the season you are and making the most of it, and just not being afraid to ask for the help that you need in order to achieve your goals in that particular season. So, I mean, I found it relatively smooth sailing. I eventually decided to leave work as a professional, and now I work part-time as an entrepreneur and part-time as an executive because I'm straddling two industries, so to speak. So for me, it actually gave me more impetus. It actually gave me more drive and ambition to pursue my goals and make impact, because the reality is I'm trying to create a world that my own children and generations after them will live in. So I can't sort of rest on my laurels and saying, you know, I'm now a mom, you know. As Sheryl Sandberg said, women, don't lean out before you've had an opportunity to lean in. Don't count yourself out of the game. And I think sometimes we can be our own worst enemies, and we literally get flustered by these life events that they are, of course, transformational. And having a baby and being a mom is clearly life-changing, but it can also be the beginning of something new. And I would encourage more women, if you're interested in longevity in the energy space, it's just to embrace your seasons, find a mentor or a sponsor, talk, join circles, join women's networks, and focus on developing your professional and personal skills. Technical competence is one thing, but your soft skills will also obviously count for you as you advance the career ladder.
Yeah, definitely. I really like that. If she has support, that was a key one that you said. But how do you also feel being a woman in a male-dominated space? So for me, for example, I grew up in a family of only girls. I went to an only girls secondary school, and then I went to university studying chemical engineering. And I found it very strange that I was one of the only few girls there, and they're working in energy. So also, how do you find that?
So there's two distinctions I want to make. So you can work in the energy industry and you can work on the energy industry, right? So for instance, you can be in a role where you're like your professional services provider, like an accountant or consultant or lawyer, and your clients are in the energy industry, or you can work in the industry as an engineer or a technician or a STEM specialist, for instance. The one thing I would say is that look for opportunities to make impact and to make a difference. At entry level, there's no shortage of women coming out of universities with degrees like engineering or maths or technology looking to enter the energy industry. What tends to happen is what is well known in research as the pyramid effect, right? So this idea that at entry level, there's scores and hundreds of women who are entering the industry, but by the time they reach middle management, for whatever reason, they start to drop off the ladder. And that could be as a result of several things. It could be because the institutions they work in are not progressive and don't provide supportive environments for moms. It could actually be because women themselves count themselves out of the game and don't actually take advantage of the opportunities that are before them. So what I would just say is this issue of personal and professional development and mentorship. Have a very clear understanding of your organization's goals. If it aligns with yours, pursue it relentlessly and fearlessly. And I've always been someone who's not afraid of visibility. I've always been someone who's never been afraid to own my own space, own both my successes and my failures and my challenges, because I think representation and visibility are very important. And the fact that I'm here having this conversation about the energy industry or doing my thing on some platform or speaking at some engagement means that there will be one young woman in university who is looking up to me and is encouraged to pursue her own dream because I'm making myself visible. Of course, I know we all have different types of personalities and not everybody likes to be in front of the stage or in camera, but my thing I always say is that it's not about you, right? A lot of the reason why I do what I do is because of other people that I'm looking to motivate and inspire. And if I'm going up that ladder, I want to make sure that I'm also pulling up people up the ladder. I don't like boasting about things like I'm the first woman in this space to do this, because the question I will always ask, and it's laudable, it's important, but the question I always ask is, how many other women in that space are you empowering? Right? It's even more satisfying to say I was the first woman to do this, and you know what, in my lifetime there were 2, 3, 4, 10 women who also came into that position and they actually changed the game.
Wow, I absolutely love that. It's not about you, own your space. I really, really love that. So thinking that it's not about you, what you're doing is to encourage others and pull other people up as well along the way as well. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Rolake. Those are all my questions, but other people have asked questions. So I think the first one was, do you offer advisory services to a new mining co on the ideal hybrid energy mix? So I think you're talking about your social enterprise in RTD Africa. So do you offer these services?
Yeah. So I think if it's for a mining company, that would actually fall under the work I do as a consultant with my consulting firm, Energy Inc. Advisors. So I'm advising sort of large resource and energy companies. And yes, that's certainly something that I would be willing to have a conversation with you on. You can send me an email to Rolake at Energy Inc. Advisors. That's Energy Inc. Advisors as one word.com, and I'll be happy to take that forward.
Great, thank you so much, Rolake. The next question is, what's your opinion of the recently announced NLNG FID on Train 7, while the local gas distribution channel remains underdeveloped?
Wow, big question. So for those who may not be aware, NLNG is Nigerian Liquefied Natural Gas company, and it's a joint venture between NNPC, the state oil firm, and 3 international oil companies. But the international oil companies own the majority, so it's essentially a private company. And it's just announced a first investment decision on its Train 7, which is going to produce, I think it's 8 million metric tons of liquefied natural gas per annum. So what that means is that once it does that, Nigeria will now be exporting about 30 million tons of LNG per annum overseas. And the major challenge with gas is that gas can be used for many, many sources. But as a gas investor, I'm not going to invest $1 in any project if I don't have a clear line of sight to market access, right? And there's always been a conflict between whether we use our gas primarily as an export commodity and sell to markets in the Far East, or whether we use it domestically. The challenge is because of the legal and regulatory framework, export projects have proved to be more profitable because you can essentially sell your LNG overseas under long-term contracts. So we're talking 20, 25-year contracts that guarantees you a price, right? Obviously, over the last few decades, Nigeria has introduced what you call a DSO, a domestic supply obligation, where gas producers are obliged to supply a certain portion of what they produce to domestic users. But we've had challenges in the economics of domestic projects, particularly upstream, because there's a $2.50 net back, and I don't want to get too complicated here, pricing mechanism. I think that is going to change. One of the things that we're seeing that will change that picture is in February, the Minister of Petroleum Resources, Timibri Silva, introduced a Nigeria Gas Network Transportation Code, which will help ease some of the infrastructure bottlenecks in the gas distribution system and allow the shared use of pipelines, allow those who own pipelines to provide access to those who are producing gas so that they can transit and supply to their markets. So I think we still have a long way to go. There are several investments that are being made. For instance, the AKK pipeline that will transport gas from the south to the north of Nigeria. Again, that contract has been awarded. So it's not all doom and gloom. Gas has so many uses. I would say more than 20 uses, from fertilizers to petrochemicals to LNG to compressed natural gas, CNG, to our cooking gas, which is clean cooking, LPG. So I think there's huge potential there, and I'm seeing good signs, at least on the legal and regulatory side. And finally, I think what we need to move towards is a willing buyer, willing seller system.
Okay, thank you, Rolake. The next question, you kind of spoken about this already, but the person asks, is it possible to significantly rely on renewables in Africa?
But when they say significantly rely, so let me give you some statistics. Nigeria actually already generates about 20% of her energy from hydropower, which is renewable. So it depends on what you mean significantly. Is it viable and cheaper and cost effective to utilize renewables? Then it will determine whether that significantly is efficient, whether it's optimal. Right now, I would say across Africa on average, and I'm just extrapolating, probably about 70%, 60 to 70% on average of our energy is from non-renewable sources like fossil fuels. We're seeing countries like South Africa, Rwanda, and Kenya embark on large-scale investment in solar, hydro, solar PV, and solar CSP projects. So many countries are further along than Nigeria is, primarily because they've been able to develop a stable regulatory framework to do so, and the business and investment environment has been conducive to those types of investments. So I think we will have to increase the proportion of renewables that go into some of these things, and also because governments are introducing legislation to curb emissions, and that is also going to drive the pattern and trajectory of investment in the industry.
Thank you. Thank you. If anyone wants to contact you, what's the best way to reach you? So services or
Yeah, I would
otherwise?
say just follow me on social media, first of all, at Rolake Akinkugbe. Pretty much that's the way it's written across most of my platforms. Send me a DM on social media at Rolake Akinkugbe. And because obviously I'm managing and running several different businesses and also professional endeavors, then depending on what you require, we can have a conversation. I see a question there about mentoring. I do mentor. Although I will say that for individual mentoring, and I'm at full capacity because I only do 2 structured individual mentoring programs a year where I have 2 mentees every year. However, I do corporate mentoring via a quarterly webinar. It's called the Positive Energy Corporate Mentoring. And then we have networks like Awadi Network where they actually run a structured mentoring program. WIMBIZ, Women in Business, also runs a structured mentoring program. And for the guys, I have a male friend of mine who's actually running a mentoring program for young professional men too.
Okay. Do you have the details of the program for the guys, for the male?
Yeah, I can send it again. Send me a DM and I will provide you details. And of course, follow WIMBIZ, follow Awadi Network, African Women in Energy Development. It's run by a friend of mine, Ujunwa Ojemini. And I'm actually a mentor on that particular program. That's where I have one of my individual mentors, and they can connect you either as a mentor or as a mentee, depending on what your requirement is.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rolake. It has been so informative. It's been very encouraging as well to hear all the opportunities, all that's going on in the energy space in Nigeria, and even the challenges and what you think is going to come out of this. So just to summarize, this is Ignite Energy Africa. We're on Instagram, Ignite Energy Africa, and we're a knowledge and innovation hub. We share information of what's going on in the energy industry, particularly in Africa, share knowledge, and so people are aware of what's going on in the space. We're interviewing a range of energy experts to share their knowledge with us and tell us about the opportunities that are available in this space. Today we had the fantastic Rolake. She shared so much useful information, and please follow her on her page on Instagram and also look at the work she's doing with Ignite Africa. And she shared her details with us, so please follow her. Rolake, do you have any last few words to say or share with everyone?
No, pretty much. Thank you so much for what you do with Ignite Africa, Vome. I've really enjoyed this. Follow my handles, let's engage. I'm passionate about energy, I'm passionate about mentoring and career development, and passionate about finance. So I look forward to engaging with you all. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for joining us, Rolake. Have a good day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Save, oh. Don't forget to save.
I will say about it. Bye.
Bye.